I can't be the only one that thinks Nintendo has changed over the past decade. So, in light of the recent events, I decided I would do some research on the current president of Nintendo, Shuntaro Furukawa. As a quick background, the previous presidents of Nintendo were all from the Yamauchi family up until 2002, where Hiroshi Yamauchi passed it on to Satoru Iwata. So through most of my lifetime at least, Satoru Iwata was the president of Nintendo. Yamauchi passing it on to Satoru Iwata was actually a very big deal because up until then, it was only the Yamauchis that ran the show. But Yamauchi saw something in Satoru Iwata that many of us recognize, but at the time it was seen as a big risk. He saw somebody that understood the value of gaming, that understood the value of playing, of innovating, of all around just creating a very memorable experience for children as well as their families. I know currently people like to argue that Nintendo has really only become innovative and gimmicky in the years following the GameCube, but keep in mind the D-pad was an innovation. People playing video games at home was an innovation. Throughout the NES's life, they included the light gun, the power glove, the mat on the floor, Rob even. They opted to go for the more powerful console when they got to the Super Nintendo, but at that point in time, they were focused on the 16 bits. That was their innovation. They were looking for the power. And even then, they threw in a Super Scope light gun. They found ways to use technology in their video games to make their video games more enjoyable, whether it's with the Super FX chip or even just general parallax scrolling. And obviously, by the time they got to the Nintendo 64, they wanted to find a way to implement a joystick, something that was more commonly used by grabbing it with your hand and moving it around like you're at the arcade machine. And then introducing things that have become staples in gaming like the rumble feature, and even finding ways to bring their handheld games onto the big screen through the Game Boy player and the like. And really just handheld gaming in general, they made it normal. It was already popular as heck, and then Pokemon just took it and made it even more popular. And then the consoles just continued to advance, and as the consoles advanced, the handheld stuff would advance with it. Smaller and portable handhelds, adding colors to those handhelds. Every step of the way, there was some form of innovation, and the innovation was often more than just simply a boost in power. You can argue the Super Nintendo was a boost in power, but they also added buttons, and the buttons that were added onto the Super Nintendo controller changed the way you game as compared to the NES as well. Not to mention the consoles just looked unique and fun. The way you pop the cartridge out of the SNES, or even the way the NES looked as it sat on your counter. The Nintendo 64 looked like a spaceship. These things all fell in line with the general vibe of Nintendo at the time. They were gaming consoles, with the keyword being gaming. Now, obviously, modern day consoles don't really need to look like games anymore, since the gamers that were playing this stuff as kids are still gamers today, so you don't really need to appeal to it aesthetically as much. And for a while there, they were getting very boring. The Wii had like a little bit of a sleek design for the time, but that plus the 360 and the PS3, they had a hint of uniqueness to it, but you can kind of see the trajectory we were going. By the time we got to the Wii U and the PS4 and the Xbox One, they all just kind of got really boring. And I feel like we kind of got a little bit of that back. Maybe with the Switch, not so much. If you get the colored Joy-Cons more so, I think. But otherwise, it's just a tablet with some joysticks at the end. But the PS5, I think it's so ugly, and I love it for that reason. I don't even own a PS5, but just aesthetically, the way it looks made it feel like it was a gaming console. But to kind of steer things back a little bit, Nintendo always was innovating. Even when they got to the GameCube, they took a console that should have looked like whatever the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox looked like. They put it in a purple lunchbox with the deformed shaped controller and added a little yellow joystick on it as a nub. So even if it looked like they were trying to go head to head with the competition with the types of games they were developing, you can still see that Nintendo spirit in that console. But the reality is the GameCube, like the Super Nintendo before it, was just a more powerful version of what came prior, that being the NES for the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo 64 for the GameCube. As much as they tried to revolutionize aspects of it, they tried to innovate, and they did innovate a lot of things. I don't want to discredit them for what they were able to accomplish. They didn't really have that aha feature that would make separate consoles more memorable, like the NES's D-pad, the Nintendo 64's joystick, the Wii's motion, the Wii U's gamepad, the Switch being hybrid, 2 screens on the Nintendo DS, 3D on the 3DS. The Super Nintendo has 16 bits and the GameCube has 480 pixels. So by the time 2002 came around, not only was Nintendo losing, they felt as though gaming was going in the wrong direction. And Iwata believed that this whole idea of just making a more powerful console would eventually get a little stale. Now, you can argue he was probably wrong about that, considering the amount of people that are still buying Sony when their only true innovation has been nothing but power for the past 30 years. But the point is, he had a philosophy of how Nintendo should grow, and Yamauchi saw that in him, and that's why he wanted Iwata to take over. And all of those gimmicks I just mentioned, they happened under his watch. For better or for worse. I'm not saying they're all home runs. The Wii U gamepad wasn't exactly revolutionary, although you could argue that it was a failure because of the marketing more than the actual tablet itself, since I think the Switch was the actualized Wii U. And I know you could only play with that tablet in the same house that you were sitting in, but I mean, for people like me, it felt portable because I could play it in my bed, I can play it on the couch, I could play wherever I wanted. And arguably, that's what I do with my Switch. I may take it places sometimes, but for the most part, I'm just playing it around the house. Although that gives me a whole other discussion that I would like to have at some point about the difference between portability and pocketability, because for me, the Switch is portable, but I don't take it anywhere because it's too big. The 3DS is my travel console, but we'll save that discussion for another time. Either way, under Iwata's tenure, you can see all of these innovations coming into full fruition. They might not have invented the touchscreen, but the DS was the first touchscreen gaming device. And likewise with the 3D. Even if the 3D did eventually die out, the fact that you can use a 3D console without wearing glasses is crazy innovative. But Nintendo didn't invent 3D. However, they still found a way to implement it. And the Wii U was just the precursor to the Switch. And the Switch was created under Iwata's rule, even if it didn't hit the market until 2 years after his passing. Now, keep in mind, after Iwata passed away, the person to take over was Kimishima. Kimishima wasn't exactly a nobody. He had a lot of experience in Nintendo. You guys remember how prior to Reggie Fils-Aimé being the president of Nintendo of America, the idea of the leadership of Nintendo was just non-American old businessmen in suits? Yeah, that was Kimishima. He was the president of Nintendo of America prior to Reggie Fils-Aimé. So it wasn't like they just threw anybody in there after Iwata passed away, but I think Kimishima was always seen as kind of an interim. He was more about the business, less about the gaming side of things. Now, Shuntaro Furukawa, on the other hand, is only 53 years old. When he took over for Kimishima, Kimishima was in his 60s. It was getting close to that retirement age. So they threw somebody in that was young blood, with Furukawa being only in his 40s at the time. This was, by all accounts, a very positive appointment for many Nintendo fans. There are quite a few videos of some popular YouTubers just praising him. Not necessarily overpraising him, but the idea that they brought somebody young in. And not only was he young, he actually spoke to the fans. He had a lot of quotes, a lot of press conferences, a lot of things that went to the public that made people appreciate him more. Iwata and Reggie, they had their directs. They were appealing to us in a different way. But after Iwata passed away, we weren't really hearing things for a few years. So it was fresh when Furukawa came in. Now, Furukawa actually joined in 1994, where he spent 10 years as an accountant for Nintendo of Europe, living in Germany. I don't know what exactly his involvement was at the time, but there was a whole Nintendo cartel thing going around, which led to the European Commission fining Nintendo and 7 of its European distributors for colluding to prevent trade in low-priced products. Essentially, they were colluding to prevent exports to high-priced countries from low-priced countries, because they wanted to make sure if you were living in a higher cost of living area, you were paying more money. Prices to play consoles and games differed widely from one European Union country to another during the period investigated by the Commission, with the United Kingdom up to 65% cheaper than Germany and the Netherlands. The Commission was quoted as saying, "Every year, millions of European families spend large amounts of money on video games. They have the right to buy the games and consoles at the lowest price the market can possibly offer, and we will not tolerate collusive behavior intended to keep prices artificially high." Now, again, I don't know to what extent Furukawa was involved in this. I imagine if he was higher up there, he would have gotten a lot more trouble. But he was an accountant, a fairly popular person at Nintendo for 10 years in Germany during this investigation. So even if he was not guilty, even if he had nothing to do with any of this, I'm sure he had a lot of connections and a lot of conversations with people that understood the value of finding ways to mess with the market to ensure that Nintendo is making as much money as possible. So even if it's not an indictment on him, Nintendo has a history of these anti-consumer practices. But as far as Furukawa was concerned, he had risen up the corporate ladder and was working in global marketing, in the executive department no less. He was also an outside director of the Pokemon Company, technically the Nintendo representative in the board of directors. So I don't know how much impact he actually had on decisions that were made during that time, but I've heard a lot of people kind of associate him with the Pokemon Company. I don't necessarily think it's fair because I don't understand how the checks and balances system worked. I know Nintendo is pretty hands-off with them normally, or I believe the only time they actually stepped in was when it was affecting their own brand. Now you could argue that concept in and of itself is wrong, because Nintendo owns like a third of the company. But still, I don't know if necessarily Furukawa is bad because he worked with the Pokemon guys. Either way, throughout the first few years of his tenure, he made some quotes that kind of set an idea of how Nintendo was going to flow. He was the one that kept insisting around 4 years ago that the Nintendo Switch was in the middle of its life cycle, that they would spend 2022 diversifying their library on the console to entice people to purchase an OLED. Mind you, this is during the time where people were clamoring for a Switch Pro, something more powerful to play their Switch 1 games on, something that would just basically be a Switch, but better. Basically exactly what the Switch 2 is. But momentum was high, they were still selling well, they didn't feel a need to move on yet. And I actually was on board for this. I didn't think the Switch needed to move on either. I was arguing with people back in 2020 that it made no sense for the Switch 2 to come out until 2025 minimum. I remember early on they said the Switch would last 7 or 8 years, so I figured it would be delayed another year or two because of the pandemic. But it was funny to see that Nintendo kept reiterating the fact that they were sticking with the Switch for a lot longer than normal, and yet from as early as 2019 when the PS5 was going to be coming out soon, people thought we were going to be getting a new Switch. And the conversation just kept going and going until maybe the OLED came out where they settled down for a bit. But even then, that was like a year and a half until they started talking about when the Switch 2 was going to get announced. Now, I think around 2021 is when I started to kind of raise an eyebrow because of statements that Furukawa would make. And funnily enough, it all started with a video that I watched Arlo make about the same quote. Arlo had eaten the quote right up, and I think he genuinely was happy to hear what Furukawa had said. But I've also learned over time that despite the fact that I do genuinely enjoy Arlo's stuff, and based off of what I've heard about him, he seems like he's a great person, but I have a very different perspective on the way I enjoy games than he does. Which again does not mean he's bad, and I'm not attacking him in any way. I'm just saying that I think we're very different when it comes to Nintendo. The quote specifically was Furukawa being asked about the development timeframes for hardware. He replied saying that they're always doing research and development. You must do all sorts of various preparations to make one new console. And the truth is that you can't stop. Ultimately, the deciding factor as to whether or not something becomes an actual product is whether or not it creates a new experience. Currently, the Switch's sales are exceedingly favorable and achievements are also good. But I have zero peace of mind, he said. It doesn't matter how many hits you get, in the entertainment business, people someday do lose interest. Up until now, we have repeatedly had the experience of our business taking a nosedive. Because of this, I myself, as well as those within the company, do not at all think the current state of affairs will keep going and going. Every year is a do or die situation. You must give new customers fresh surprises, and our existence can slip into obscurity at any time. I always have this kind of sense of crisis. Now, when I read the quote, I interpreted it, I think, a very different way than what Arlo did, for example. In my mind, it meant that they were being cautious with the current state of the Switch, and they didn't want to move away from it too soon. And I figured when he was mentioning the new experiences, he was talking about how the next console would revolutionize gaming once again. And I don't even think he needed to do that much to actually revolutionize it. I think the way the Switch was set up going into the Switch 2 just needed a little bit of a gimmick. Maybe even the mouse controls and the camera could be that little gimmick that they were looking for. I personally thought the idea of redoing what the Wii U was, only this time actually making it so that each player gets to hold their own Switch, with the fifth screen being the TV that everybody plays around, would have been cool. Creating a multiplayer experience similar to the old Legend of Zelda game where you can connect your GameCube to the TV. But that's besides the point. What I expected was that Nintendo would introduce something in addition to the Switch that was actually still kind of a groundbreaking achievement. Arlo, on the other hand, seemed to just kind of be excited with the fact that it seemed like they were not going to do anything different. He was very excited at the prospect of not having a new gimmick, of not doing anything revolutionary, of not moving away from what the Nintendo Switch was and what it represents. When I watched this video back in 2021, I remember thinking to myself, yeah, it would be a good idea for the Switch to stretch it out for a few more years. After all, games were still selling, units were still moving. Why not? Just take it slow. There's no need to move on to a Switch 2 yet. When I saw that the Switch Pro was nothing more than a Switch OLED, in my mind, yeah, it's a good idea. Just keep the generation moving for a little bit longer. There was no need to start over. But I also felt like Nintendo was just kind of going about it in a very pragmatic and smart way. I felt it was good for the time, but I was also very worried that it meant that next generation nothing exciting would be coming. But it was more like a minor concern. Because I thought that maybe the Switch OLED would come out, the Nintendo Switch would do a little bit better, start slowing down in sales eventually, they drop the price, continue to do well, and then by the time we would get to the Switch 2, Nintendo would have to find a way to innovatively win us over again. Obviously, nothing slowed down, the Switch did just keep doing better and better. When the Switch 2 was announced, I kind of had similar feelings to when the Switch OLED came out. In my mind, I was like, you know what? Yeah, this kind of makes sense. They might as well just keep going with what's good instead of taking a risk. I was a little upset that we'd get none of that Nintendo magic, but not upset enough to make a big deal over. I figured, you know what? Give us an upgraded system, charge us $350 for it, keep the games around $70, make it backwards compatible, make it so that it's a little bit of a cross-platform experience where games release on both consoles. Keep it simple enough where it remains as budget-friendly as the current generation is. Basically turn it into a situation where somebody can just upgrade their current Switch for another one and have the same experience, but with slightly better hardware and software. The thing is, when the Switch 2 was announced, yeah, that's what they did. They made it so that you were just upgrading your experience. The next-gen approach, if you will. Which, like I said, I understand why Nintendo was going with that approach, but the problem is when they decided to take the next-gen approach, they showed up with the next-gen prices. And more so, the next-gen attitude, the next-gen price gouging. The console is no longer the budget option. That was my first red flag. Even if you think the $450 price tag is justifiable, Nintendo historically was significantly cheaper. It is no longer significantly cheaper. And then, I mean, you know how it goes. I've said this in 100 videos by now, but the prices of the games, the DLC packs, the upgrading, and the accessories and whatnot. And of course, the fact that they didn't drop the price on literally anything. With all this going on, I saw somebody mention in a comment that Furukawa was the reason to blame because he used to work for Pokemon. And that's kind of what inspired me to do a little bit of research on him. As I did that research, I ended up back at the Arlo video again. And in that video, obviously he was discussing that quote. Rereading that quote today, I no longer think the same thing that I thought 4 years ago. I actually think Arlo predicted it and interpreted it much better than I did. I was looking at it from a much more naive and optimistic angle. Arlo was very ecstatic at the fact that the console was going to be the exact same thing, and we were basically just going to get Nintendo, but in the same style as PlayStation 5 and Xbox, where the only true upgrade is becoming more of a modern console, which basically means the graphics, the price gouging, the larger file sizes, and just everything that I've been complaining about for the past month. And it's clearer now than it was for me ever before, but I think the Nintendo that I grew up loving is non-existent at this point. The innovative and the optimistic, and really the Satoru Iwata Nintendo. It's just not there anymore. It's a different philosophy. The last time this might have existed was around the GameCube era, but back then they still had to find a way to make it friendly for the family, friendly for children. They didn't really pull it off with the GameCube, but around the same time they pulled off the DS and then eventually the Wii. But you can still see the heart and soul of Nintendo during that time. As opposed to now, where they're going for just the next powerful console, the same way they did with the SNES and the same way they did with the GameCube. Now it feels much more soulless. Now it feels much more modern. Perhaps I'm looking into it far too deeply, but every Furukawa quote I have come by in the past few years just rings differently now. He is not a risk taker. He is not looking to innovate. He is not looking to implement Nintendo practices that at least I have become accustomed to. I'm not sure if that doesn't apply for others. He's looking to succeed in the same manner that Sony succeeds in. He wants it to remain just a stagnant line with the Switch. The naming is just going to be a Switch 2, and then a Switch 3, and it's just going to get a little bit bigger with slightly different Joy-Cons, and nothing much is going to change. This is his focus. It's very clear now. He's risk-averse. It works for Sony, it works for Apple, it'll work for Nintendo too. And I actually think it will work, but it is not the Nintendo that I signed up for. It's not what I want from Nintendo. And I'm nobody, I get that. I'm just a random guy on YouTube complaining about a price of a console. But if Nintendo doesn't have that magic for me, I promise you, there are so many more people that have lost that same feeling. That magic is what has kept me buying Nintendo products. I am still amazed by how phenomenal the Switch 1 was, that it was able to implement the home console experience on a handheld. But it has been 8 years since that knocked my socks off. And as somebody that is still enjoying the Nintendo Switch and doesn't really care to upgrade for 4K, like many other people that own a Nintendo console do as well, there is just no reason to sacrifice what is going great for me in order to risk what may come from the Switch 2. I can get the full Nintendo Switch 2 experience on my original Switch. But the problem is they also accounted for that. That's why they've kept the prices as high as they were. That's why they've kept it so similar. The Switch 2 is as boring as a Switch Pro, and that's intentional. That's by design. They're going after the individuals that strictly want nothing more than a more powerful Switch. And again, if that's what you want, by all means, go for it. But the greedy approach to it is just very off-putting. It screams to me that Nintendo is no longer led by somebody that understands what Nintendo is. It screams to me as somebody that is trying to appeal to gamers rather than Nintendo fans. The Switch has sold so many units that I can pretty much guarantee a large chunk of them own another console. Or maybe they are PC gamers, and they probably identify more with those other consoles than they do with the Switch. I imagine people like that are the most ecstatic for the next Switch, because in their minds, that's how the next console works. It's the same one, with a different number behind the name, and everything just looks prettier. But those of us that love Nintendo for the Nintendo magic, we're the ones missing out. Those of us that don't care about the flashiest graphics, or all the different modern day practices, and realistically, we're the ones that bought the Wii U's, and even the 3DS's before the price drop. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is it is now clearer to me than ever that Furukawa is not only not Satoru Iwata, he's not Nintendo. I really hope the Switch 2 fails the same way the GameCube was failing, so that somebody that understands what it means to be Nintendo ends up taking the reins. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you guys on the next one.